Hi everybody, in this video we're going to be talking about how to arrange the classroom in a way that you can prevent challenging behaviors to occur and set your students up for success. So in this video our objectives are here to the left, and then for our agenda we're first going to talk about rules and then routines and schedules and then the physical arrangement of the classroom. And then we're going to wrap it up with talking about some environmental cues, or what we call prompts, that you guys can use to remind your students of the correct behavior. So before we get started on rules, I love this quote. It says, "A good teacher, like a good entertainer, must first hold his audience's attention, so then he can teach his lesson." And so I think this really speaks to what we talk about in this chapter and some of the other chapters in this course. But setting your environment up in a way that promotes good behavior allows you to not spend so much time on dealing with those challenging behaviors and actually lets you teach. So in this chapter, we talk about, a couple of things that you guys can do. These are what we call antecedent strategies or preventive strategies. So things like, looking at how to arrange the classroom that best fits whatever lesson that you're teaching, or where to place a student that has challenging behavior where you can constantly see them and be in proximity with them. Those things reduce challenging behavior and therefore allow you to spend more time actually teaching your lesson and teaching the content. So anyways, I really like that quote, especially with regards to, making sure you arrange the environment so that there's no challenging behaviors, so that you can have the audience's attention and you can actually teach. Okay, so let's talk about roles. The role of roles in education. First of all, school and classroom roles are kind of our basic parameters that we set for student behavior. These are the things that tell students how they should behave within your classroom. And some people argue against having roles in the classroom and things like that. So there are arguments for and against it. But the perspective that we take in this course is that roles are important in the classroom setting. And basically that kind of, our whole world is made up of rules, whether you want to accept that or not. But, learning to be considerate of rules and following rules is really part of being a responsible adult. And a lot of our basic academic concepts are rule-based. Your math with your equations and things like that, very rule-based. So our argument here is that in the real world, you're going to have to follow rules. We have social norms everywhere, which are actually, rules of how we kind of live in sync with everybody. We have this rule of when the elevator opens, you let the people off before you get on. We wear shirts and we wear clothes everywhere and things like that. So those are those basic society rules. But other than that, when you get out in the real world and you start working, your boss is going to have rules and things like that. You're going to have rules in your workplace. So, being considerate of rules and learning how to follow them is part of just kind of being a responsible adult and functioning in general. Making sure that the rules in your classroom, you really need to make sure that they're socially valid and they can be a predictor for later success. So you don't have a rule just because a certain behavior annoys you or because you don't want the students to engage in a certain behavior. You have a rule because learning to follow that rule is something that they can take with them into the real world, and it's what we call socially valid, and it can help them be successful in the real world. So think about that. When you guys come up with your rules, think about, is this a rule that I just have in my classroom because I just want the students to do this? Or is this a rule that's actually socially valid and is actually going to help them function in the real world? So is this a rule that we have in everyday life that they need to follow and will help them be successful in the future? Also, when you guys do write rules, effective rules are typically shorter in number and written sufficiently. So, usually if you're in grade school, you're working with kids, even your younger kids, your kindergarten, first grade, second grade, third grade, you want something that's really simple. So be kind, be nice, things like that. You don't want this really long written rule that's really just complex. And also it's good to have just a couple of rules. So they typically say about 3 to 5 rules in your classroom. So think about your top 3 to 5 things that you want the students to do, and then write them as clear and concise as possible. Okay, when you guys teach rules, typically rules are taught in a positive manner. So what we mean by that is you're teaching the student what you want them to do, not what you don't want them to do. So we hear a lot of teachers and, parents in general, they tell their kids, don't throw that book, don't jump on the couch, things like that. So that is not stated in a positive manner because they're telling the kids what they don't want them to do, but the kid you didn't actually provide them with something that they can do. And if you guys do have kids, you'll notice you'll say, don't jump on the couch, and they'll go and they'll do something else, and you're like, don't do that, don't do that. And so everything they're doing, they're things that you don't want them to do, but you've never provided them with an instruction of something appropriate for them to do. So instead of jumping on the couch, you can say, hey, you guys can come down here and play with toys right here. Or, hey, you can go to your desk and work on an activity with a student, things like that. So think about the way you say things to students. You always want to say it in a positive manner. So tell them what you want them to do as opposed to what you don't want. So for example, we always have these memes with Bart Simpson. And it says, I will not yell fire in a crowded classroom. Well, this is not stated in positive terms. If you have the word not in what you're telling the kid, it's not stated in positive terms because you're telling them something not to do and not something that you want them to do. So when you walk in the hallway and you just say, no running, no talking, no hitting, okay, those are fine. You're telling them what not to do, but then you're not telling them something that you want them to do. So, we walk in the hallway, we're staying quiet right now, things like that. We use kind hands or we use nice hands, things like that is what you actually want to say. And so here it is right here. So we walk in the hallway, use your words, keep your hands to yourself, raise your hand to speak or use an inside voice. So these are all things that they actually can do. And you'll find your book pointed this out, which I think is kind of interesting concept. But kids know everything that they're not supposed to do because we keep telling them, no running, don't do this, don't do this. But then when you ask them, what can you do? Sometimes they can't tell you. So I really want you guys to work on getting used to, don't say no, but just kind of say, hey, we walk in the hallway instead of no running. That tells them an appropriate way that they can behave. And also when you guys are using rules, you want to make sure that the rules are actual behaviors that you can measure and that we can observe and measure and things like that. So make sure that, when you guys are using your rules, like walking in the hallway, keep hands to yourself, things like that, they're actual behaviors that we can, like I said, observe, measure, and actually enforce. So remember when we talked about behaviors, we talked about the dead man's test or the leaf test. So you guys can use this as well when you think of the behaviors that you're talking to kids about. If you say no running, well, a dead man can follow that. No running, a dead man cannot run. So that's not considered a behavior. But if you say walk in the hallway, a dead man can't walk in the hallway. So that would be considered a behavior. And you can do that with the same leaf as well. If you say no talking, a leaf cannot talk, so that's not considered a behavior. But if you say, keep your hands to yourself, a leaf can't do that, so that would be considered behavior. And then once again, just making sure that your behaviors are stated in a positive way and using positive terms. So those are all things that we've kind of talked about in previous modules. Okay, with regards to teaching rules, I want you guys to remember kind of 3 main things. So first, you want to make sure that you connect your rule to existing and accepting principles. So we kind of have this distinction between what we call anchor rules and classroom rules. So a lot of times in our PBIS systems, they'll have anchor rules for maybe the whole school, and schools do this differently. So some schools have anchor rules for the whole school, some schools don't, but a lot of times your PBIS systems will, and anchor rules are just kind of general ways to behave, such as, be kind, be respectful, and things like that. And there's typically about 3 of them. And then your classroom rules will be kind of specific examples of those kind of anchor rules. And so when you're teaching your classroom rules, you can link them to the anchor rules. So, when you talk about keep your hands to yourself, you can talk about how that links to being respectful of other people and how that benefits them just, in life, in the everyday world. So give them a reason as to why you're teaching the rule, how it's going to benefit them. Don't just teach the rule and think that they understand it, or don't give them an explanation as to why you're teaching this rule and why this rule is important. Make sure that you model it. So this is really important. So first of all, connecting it to existing principles and modeling it. So you want to show them what an appropriate model of the rule is. And you want to make sure that you engage students. And this goes back to what we talked about in previous modules with effective teaching and giving students these opportunities to respond. Engage the students, however that is, asking them questions, have them practice it with you, things like that. And then make sure that you measure it. We talked about measuring behavior so that you can monitor their roles and you can provide feedback if you need to. So basically, giving the instruction, connecting it to existing principles, modeling it, engaging the students, and then making sure you give them opportunities to respond, to practice, and then measuring the behavior and providing that feedback and making sure that you can enforce it. That's why we state rules in terms of behaviors that we can see and measure. If you have something like, the rule in our classroom is to think positive thoughts. Well, you can't really see that and you can't really measure it. You don't know for certain if that child is thinking positive thoughts or not. And therefore, you can't really enforce it because you can't see it and you can't measure it. And if you can't enforce it and you can't monitor it, then you can't provide feedback. So that's why we state rules in observable terms, measurable terms, positive terms, and we're clear, concise, and complete. All right, here are just some examples of some rules that teachers have used. So, sorry guys. Here, rule 1, listen when your teacher is talking. Rule 2, follow directions quickly. Rule 3, respect others, and things like that. That was from a 3rd grade classroom. And then here's another example of our class rules. Be safe, be kind, use quiet school voice, raise your hand, follow directions the first time, respect others. And so this is where it kind of varies within classrooms and within schools. Kind of those anchor rules are going to be your, be kind, respect others, be safe, and then, follow directions the first time are kind of those classroom rules. And you can link that to, respecting others, those anchor rules. And then here's another one. So when you guys have your morning meetings, if you have those in your classroom, listen while others are sharing, keep your hands and feet to yourself, respect what others have to say, smile and be positive. So those are just some examples of teachers' roles in the classroom. And I have this video for you guys right here, teaching roles using movement. I'm actually going to, you guys can have these slides so you can click on it, but it's actually really cool. Each role has a movement, and the kids do it and they recite it with the teacher, and they recite it a bunch of times, and so they really get used to what the rules are and things like that, and they learn them. Okay, so in addition to rules, you guys are also going to establish some routines and schedules within your classroom. So when we talk about routines and scheduling, we're talking about the manner, timing, and location of reoccurring activities. So what do you do? What's going to be your routine when a kid needs to use the bathroom? What's going to be your routine for kids turning in their homework? What's going to be your routine for transitioning to group work? What's going to be your routine for transitioning to, maybe you want them to come up to the front and you guys are going to work on reading a story or something like that. So what are all those routines that you might need to know? What's the routine in the morning? What's the routine when you transition to lunch and things like that? Or what's the routine when you transition out of the classroom if they're going to PE or things like that? So these are things to think about, like I said, everything, especially in this module, are talking about antecedent strategies. These are proactive strategies. These are things that you guys think about before the kids either get there for the school year, typically before the kids get there for the school year. So you want to look at everything during your day and think about all the routines that you want to set up, and those are the ones that you want to teach at the very beginning of the school year. Having a routine and having appropriate scheduling, that makes things predictable, which we're talking about in a second. But if things can be predictable and students know what's going on, you can avoid a lot of potential problems. So changing the routine or springing things on kids, that can be really confusing to kids, and you find that you probably will have a lot more challenging behaviors, especially from your kids with EBD. So really taking the time out before the school semester starts to look at what routines you have in your classroom, look at your scheduling, look at what routines you need to teach, really will help you avoid potential problems and increase the probability of success within your students and also the way that your classroom runs. So I mentioned this in the last slide, but making sure that your routines and your schedules are consistent is key. So consistency is key. Remember that. Whatever routine you want to create in your classroom, that's cool. Whatever works for you, whatever works for your students, that's awesome. Just make sure that you're consistent. So if you have another teacher that has a really complex, morning routine, if you want to take that, cool, as long as you can do it, as long as you're consistent with it. If it's a little too complex and you're having trouble with it, put it down, make it simpler, make sure that you can do it and you can do it consistently. That's the key. The more that your classroom routines involve the same activities at the same time daily, the students will be able to predict what behaviors they need to engage in, and they'll be more successful, your classroom will run smoother and everything like that. So being able to predict what's occurring results in, they've shown it in the research, everything like that results in fewer problems, fewer challenging behaviors, especially from your kids with EBD. And just, and there are going to be changes to the schedule and things like that. But if there are changes to the schedule, letting your students know right when you know the change and giving them appropriate amount of time to make that change is hugely important. And you guys can do, even with your schedules, you can post visual schedules. So you can see this teacher did today's schedule, 8:15, reading, math, writing, recess, lunch. And it might be the case that, maybe one day you're switching math with writing. And a lot of times I would suggest that if you guys have these, you have them on Velcro. So that way you can easily switch math with writing. And then right when they come into the classroom in the morning, if there is a change in the schedule, you want to tell them about it and explain why there was a change in the schedule. That way they know the change. And then you also want to remind them, right before, if they originally have math and now it's writing, 5 minutes before, hey, remember, we're not going math today, we're going to do writing, and then remember why you made that change. So all those things are kind of simple things that you can do that make the schedule and make things predictable so they know what's going on, and therefore you get fewer challenging behaviors. So just kind of keep that in mind. Also, I don't know, just my preference. I love timers. So at the clinic that I work in, we have a lot of kids that have trouble with transitions. So, transitioning from the gym to the table and things like that. And one of my first interventions to go to is a timer. They work so well. So, you say, like, it might be 8:55 right here, and you say, hey, class, in 5 minutes, we're going to transition to math. And you set a timer. When the timer goes off, you'll see the kids will get up. It's kind of amazing. Well, not all the time, but it does have a high rate of success, I found. But putting that timer in there makes it just predictable, and they know that they can't distract you and more time can go by. They know that you're not trying to cheat them on time and things like that. There's a set time, and I typically put the timer where they can see it. So if you have a smart board or something like that, you can put the timer up on that, and when it goes off, then they know that's in their 5 minutes, and they get up and they can transition. So that's one of the first interventions that I typically try. It's super easy to implement, and it seems to be pretty effective. Okay, and I think the last thing that I really wanted to talk about with routines is kind of the way that you guys schedule the activities in your classroom and making sure that you really pay attention to your students and their needs when you do this. So your book gives a really good example. So the teacher says, my students are horrible during silent reading time. They can't keep it together. And you say, what's the length of time that your students can engage in silent reading before you predict there'll be problems? And the teacher says 8 minutes. And then you ask, how long does your silent reading activity typically last? And they say, about 25 minutes every day. Well, you guys can see from this conversation, the teacher knows that, hey, my kids can really only stay quiet for 8 minutes, but I've scheduled silent reading time for 25 minutes every day. And so this is not setting your students up for success. And I know you guys might not have a say as to, whether you go to math, reading, things like that. But typically teachers do have a say in what goes on in their classroom during those time periods. So that's where you really want to look at that. Maybe, and set your students up for success. So maybe you start off with 7 minutes of silent reading, and then you get them in a group and discuss a story for a couple minutes, then go back to silent reading. So you can still get your 25 minutes in, but you're doing it to a way that you're going to not run the risk of having them, you're going to prevent challenging behaviors as quickly as possible just by rearranging the environment a little differently than you originally had it. So what they typically find in the literature, and what I find too, especially teaching in college, is that smaller activity durations are associated with higher levels of student engagement. So instead of having these like massive blocks of independent work and then these massive blocks of group work, you can do smaller sections, independent for 8 minutes, group work for 8 minutes, independent for 8 minutes, group works for 8 minutes, something like that. So that way it switches them up. So when they're engaging in activities, it's not for long periods of time because you'll lose them. They'll start talking to their friends about other things. They won't pay attention to activity. But if you have smaller little sections instead of big long ones, then you have higher levels of student engagement. Okay, so now let's talk about how to physically arrange the classroom. And your book gives a couple of different ways for you guys to arrange the classroom and different kind of seating arrangements in general. So some classes will have desks. You can arrange them in a row like this. And this is probably your typical, or at least way back in the day it was, typical classroom setting, typical college classroom setting, and things like that. This is really good for independent work. And also what I like about these drawings in your book is it gives you the path that you can take as a teacher. You always want to look at how you can move throughout your desks. And it also kind of tells you where, if you're going to arrange your desk like this, for example, on the bottom left, where you want to put your students that need more support. So your kids with EBD and things like that. The closer in proximity they are to you, the more that they're engaged and the less likely they are to engage in challenging behavior. So you want those kids up front because you're typically teaching up here and you can very quickly see them and get to them. You're in closer proximity if they're up at the front. And if you have these individual desks like this, like I said, this is really good for independent work, not so good for partner work or group work. But you can also put these desks in groups. So if you guys are doing a group project or a group activity during class that day, you can put these in little groups, these desks in little groups. So it does give you that freedom to do that and to kind of rearrange the classroom that way. Sometimes there's round tables. And so here's your round tables, which is a lot better for group work and discussion and things like that. Not so good for individual work, but you can see the teacher's movement patterns. They can walk all around, and then you can see where you would want to place your children that need more support or have EBD, and that way you can easily, if something's happening, you can get to them so quickly. And then the last one, you might see that you have tables. So tables require a little bit more movement. For example, it's hard to get to the kids on the end if you go down the middle. So you kind of have to go all the way up here, circle around in the back, and things like that. So a little bit more restrictive in a sense. And then you want to make sure that your challenging kids are up here at the front, so you can easily get to them if they need help and things like that. And I always tell my teachers, it's all about perception. So even if you want to give the kids a perception that you can, if they do something wrong, you can always see them and you can look at them within 1 second. Even if you can't, give them that perception. And making these movements, you always want to be kind of looking at them, providing nonverbal cues and things like that when you're moving about the classroom. And I would say at the very beginning, when they first come in your class, if they need something and they're doing something, go to them within that 1 second. Just be cognizant of that and try really hard at the very beginning to get to them within 1 second, so they know that you're paying attention to them and they know that you're in close proximity to them. And once you've kind of established that, then you can start walking around the classroom, but they should always have this perception that you can look at them within 1 second if they engage in a challenging behavior or are not doing their work or something like that. So that's why we kind of put our challenging students here at the front. And there's a video in your module that talks about some other seating arrangements and the pros and the cons and things like that. Okay, once again, sorry, I kind of already talked about this, but teacher proximity and sightlines. So the closer you are to your students equals higher engagement with the students and lower disruption. So I would not just go to the back of the room or go to the front, sit at your desk and not walk around. You always want to be walking around. You always want to be close to your students, as close as possible, because they're more likely to engage in the work and less likely to disrupt the class. And the students with the highest probability for failure, usually you want to seat them in those locations with really quick access and proximity, which is why in the last slide we have those X's where you would want to seat them, where you could get to them really quickly and you have really quick access to them. So overall, more proximity to your students results in more opportunities for prompts, kind of those nonverbal cues, which we'll talk about in a little bit, and just prompting them to engage in the correct behavior. It allows you to encourage them if they're doing something right. It allows you to reinforce that behavior. That's hugely important, especially remember with our kids with EBD. Typically, our teachers focus on negative behaviors, reprimands. They give them attention for negative behaviors in the form of reprimands and things like that. But then when these kids are doing something appropriate, they typically don't reinforce it and give praise. So letting them be in more closer proximity to you allows you to really, if they're doing something right, if they're doing their work, then get in there and engage with them and encourage them and reinforce that behavior, and that way they get appropriate feedback and they get appropriate positive feedback and not this negative feedback. So really important. I always think of the dad from Meet the Fockers, and he's always thinking that he's watching you. That's kind of the perception that you want your students to have, that you're always right there, you're always watching them, and just moving around the classroom, always being available, always being right there is hugely important for, like I said, engagement and decreasing those challenging behaviors. And those are simple things that you can do that, don't take a lot of time. You move around the classroom, answer student questions, things like that, and things that we really should be doing as teachers that are preventative strategies for challenging behaviors. Okay, and finally, last but not least, I mentioned this in the last slide, but you always want to give the perception that you can look at your students and be close to them within 1 second or less. All right, last little section, we're going to talk about environmental cues. So there are a couple of different levels of environmental cues, essentially. So the first, most basic level are your physical cues, and these are what we call nonverbal cues. These are things like maybe a kid is talking and you look at him, making eye contact with him and kind of giving him like a gesture on your face is a nonverbal cue. You putting your finger in your mouth and telling him, shh, that's a nonverbal cue. Maybe you say that you guys are about to walk down the hall and you want to look at that kid and do like a gesture of walking, that's a nonverbal cue, things like that. All those little things that you can do that don't involve that aren't verbal, that can remind the kid how to act appropriately. And these are what we call prompts. So these are antecedent things that you guys can do that can hopefully prevent the challenging behavior from occurring. So if you can prompt the kid to walk in the hallway, then he might just walk instead of running, and you won't have to deal with the running. If you can remind a kid to be quiet or remind a kid of the rules, even just having them look at you and you pointing to the rules, maybe one to raise your hand before you speak or things like that, that can remind them of the rules and the appropriate behavior and prompt them to actually engage in that appropriate behavior. The next level is a verbal prompt. So verbal prompts are typically vocal verbal behavior. They are little hints, reminders, or instructions that increase the probability that your students will demonstrate the correct behavior. And they can also, because they are prompts, create an opportunity for positive feedback. Kind of same with your nonverbal prompts as well. These are things that increase the probability that your students will demonstrate the appropriate behavior. And then when they do, you can reinforce that behavior and give that positive feedback. Verbal prompts, just like kind of nonverbal prompts, can be used across the school day. And you can use nonverbal cues along with your verbal prompts. And then all the time with prompting, with nonverbal and verbal, you want to make sure that you do fade them over time. So you might prompt really hard, really heavy at the beginning of the school year, and then you want to try and fade it out so that way, whenever you say let's line up, the kid actually walks and lines up as opposed to runs and engages in disruptive behavior or things like that. So you might really prompt that kid at the very beginning with nonverbal. You might do, we're about to line up, and look at him and do the walking. And then you can say, remember that we want to line up, and have those nonverbal and verbal prompts. And then really heavy at the beginning of the school year. And then you want to try and fade them out and over the school year, so that way you can say, hey, let's line up, and he engages in the appropriate behavior to your actual instruction of lining up. And typically your verbal prompts, they can be really specific to decrease any negative behavior. And so that's what's cool about the verbal prompts as opposed to your nonverbal ones. You can make it really specific to the situation to make sure that you prompt them in the appropriate behavior that they're supposed to engage in. And here's some examples. As students enter the classroom, you can go ahead and prompt them and say, good morning, the bell just rang, so I'm looking for people sitting down. And that prompts them that, okay, the appropriate behavior in this situation, the bell rang, I need to sit down. And then making sure if you're prompting and they engage in the correct behavior, at least at the beginning, you want to make sure and reinforce that behavior. And then once they're reliably sitting down when the bell rings, you want to start fading that prompt out. And then you only want to reinforce the kids that sit down right when the bell rings without your verbal prompt. And then you might say before lining up, single file, quickly and quietly. That prompts them that they're supposed to line up quickly and quietly. And then maybe before they're supposed to do their work, remember that the problems aren't completed until you also check your answer, the way that we've been doing it together. So just kind of, prompting them in the correct behavior when they do it, making sure that you're reinforcing that. And then, like I said, as the semester goes on or the school year goes on, you would want to kind of fade out those verbal prompts. The last line of these environmental cues are what we call precorrection. So with precorrection, this is the largest version of prompting. Sorry. So this requires a little bit more effort on your part than maybe the other two, and it's typically reserved for your students that really have trouble in some aspect of your routine or your scheduling. And so typically it's a verbal prompt followed by a question to assess whether the student is attending and is aware of the expectation. And so the question typically engages a student and allows the teacher to really assess if the student is going to be successful or not. Was the student really attending to you? Does the student really know the rule or the procedure and what they're supposed to do? And if they don't, it may involve you doing some modeling and some reteaching as well. And it's also best used in conjunction with both verbal and nonverbal prompts and cues. So you can actually do, if you have students that have a lot of trouble and need a lot of prompting, then you can actually do all three. You can use nonverbal, you can use verbal, and you can use your pre-correction. And then I would also recommend that when you guys use your pre-correction, that you do it with multiple students, and that way you're removing the stigma from an individual student. And it also allows the student that you're trying to target to hear the correct answer a couple of times. And remember, you always want to set your student up for success. So I would suggest that if you guys, you give the prompt and then you are not sure that the kid was attending or actually heard your prompt, I would probably ask another student, what they're supposed to do. They say it. I would maybe ask another student. They give you the correct response, and then ask your kid that you're targeting. So that way they've heard it from you. But in case they weren't listening to you, they heard it from two of their peers before you actually ask them, just to make sure that they respond correctly and give them multiple chances to actually hear the rule. And so, here are kind of your continuum of environmental reminders. So at the very bottom, we got our nonverbal cues. You can use them with everyone, all the time, and just some more examples of it. So student gets eye contact. The teacher, gets the student's eye contact and makes a motion with fingers indicated walking, and the student nods. Or the teacher points to the rules, maybe the rule of raising your hand before you want to talk, and the student will then nod and raise their hand or something like that. And then you have those verbal prompts that you can use with lots of students, so groups and things like that most of the time. So, teacher calls out to the entire class, remember to walk in the hallway on the way to lunch, and all the students nod. And then your last level is going to be that pre-correction. So this is typically used with a fewer number of students, so those students that really need that additional prompting, and you typically only want to use it as needed. So just kind of keep that in mind. And here's another example of it. So the teacher calls out to the entire class, remember to walk in the hallway on the way to lunch. So that would be the same as your verbal prompt, because remember, pre-correction includes the verbal prompts, and then you're going to ask some students questions. So then the teacher says, "Hey Jimmy, I know you like lunch. How do we go down the hallway on our way?" And he says, "We walk." And she says, "Exactly, let's walk." So I would actually suggest that you guys I would probably ask two other students, or at least one other student, a question before you come to Jimmy, and that way he doesn't seem like he's being targeted, at least if you do pre-correction a lot. All right, guys, so just to provide you guys with a summary, we talked about rules, how they're the basic parameters for student behavior. Make sure that we have a smaller number and they're really clear and concise. So typically about 3 to 5. And when you guys teach rules, make sure that you use the rules are stated in positive terms, and that you provide that rationale for why you have the rule. You link it to maybe an anchor rule or existing information so they know how it will actually benefit them. You model it, you have student engagement, things like that, those opportunities to respond. If they can rehearse it, that's awesome. And then you want to provide feedback and make sure that you can enforce the rules as well. And then we talked about routines and schedules. Making sure that you're consistent and everything is predictable is huge as a preventative strategy. It decreases challenging behaviors and things like that. We talked about lesson length and sequence. So, the smaller, the little sections that you guys divide your class into, independent work, group work, things like that. Just making sure that that sequence is good and that the length of all those sections are smaller as opposed to larger. And then we talked about some different classroom arrangements and where you want to put your challenging students. We talked about teacher proximity. And then we talked about those environmental cues, so the physical and nonverbal, your verbal, and then your pre-correction. So, all right, guys, thank you so much for listening, and please let me know if you guys have any questions.